The Cave of Coffins. Guizhou province in China is home to entire caves full of coffins. Hundreds of thousands of wooden coffins have been left in the dark and dismal depths of Chinese caves, and researchers aren't entirely sure why. Many of the coffins are piled in dank pits, and there's one cave in particular that's filled with over 500 coffins stacked on top of each other. In other places, dozens of coffins have been fixed to towering cliff walls. It's been going on for 3,000 years, and scientists are absolutely baffled. Hanging coffins can be found throughout the remote valleys that hug the Yangtze River, which flows from the foothills of the Himalayas to the ocean in eastern China. Even though the coffins are pretty ancient, there's no agreed-upon reason for them being stacked in caves and nailed to rock walls. Literature from the Tang dynasty suggests that the ancient people who lived here believed that the closer they could get a coffin to the sky, the more likely they were to ascend to heaven. Another guess is that the coffins were kept in such places to keep the bodies from being eaten by wild animals. There's another theory that states the ancient people left their dead above ground with the intention of coming back for them later. Though it's a mystery why anyone would want to do that. Maybe they were waiting for the dead to rise and form an army of zombies. There are a lot of questions and very few answers. One of the biggest mysteries is that nobody knows how the cave coffins were even nailed to the high walls. Primitive humans somehow figured out how to transport a coffin with a body halfway up a sheer cliff, and they did it hundreds and hundreds of times. It's a stunt that even today would be impossible without modern equipment. And now for number 8. But first, it's shout-out time. I need to give a big thank you to Kristen Harrington for your generous super thanks. Subscribe to join the Origins Explained family. The Pit of Death. The animalistic past of human beings is difficult to ignore when you're an archaeologist, especially if you were part of the crew that recently had to investigate the remains of humans that were brutally sacrificed 3,000 years ago. A team of engineers began laying water pipes in a chalky stream when they found something foul. They uncovered an ancient pit of death in Oxfordshire, England. Archaeologists were called in to investigate, and they soon identified the skeletons as being from the Iron Age. The entire area surrounding the death pit was once a large settlement. Other things were found besides just skeletons, like horse bones and primitive tools. One individual was uncovered with their skull placed at their feet, and a dead woman was found with her feet chopped off and her arms tied uncomfortably behind her head. The people in the pit were clearly mutilated and buried in very unusual positions. Neil Holbrook from Cotswold Archaeology told reporters that all the evidence points to human sacrifice. But why? Why do you think people needed to practice this kind of barbaric sacrifice? The best guess is that it had something to do with appeasing the gods. All across the ancient world, brutal sacrifices were made to ask divine forces for help, or it was to apologize for some perceived slight made against the gods. If there was a flood or a famine, sacrifices had to be made to chill the gods out. Something terrible must have happened here that resulted in one of the most savage rituals ever found in England. Enon Chapel. Enon Chapel was opened in the city of London in 1822. It was one of the most horrible places in Victorian England. The chapel was built above an open sewer system, so locals who visited the chapels suffered from the disgusting smells of waste and nastiness. The whole place was also overrun by rats and insects, and the atmosphere around Enon Chapel was so putrid that any meat left out would rot in a matter of hours. Even though Enon Chapel was so clearly disgusting, people still went to regular church services. Testimonies from the 19th century say the congregation would sometimes pass out from the rank stench of death. There was a lot more going on at the chapel than the congregation realized. In 1839, authorities wanted to replace the open sewer to make the situation better. But when they started digging underneath the chapel, they discovered something truly appalling. The guy who built the chapel, corrupt Baptist minister W. House, had been burying bodies in a pit right underneath the floorboards. Over the years, he'd stuffed about 12,000 bodies into a space that was roughly 60 feet long and 12 feet wide. He'd done it because people paid him to bury their loved ones, but instead, he stacked them beneath the floor. It was essentially a basement stacked to the brim with rotting bodies, so it's no wonder people passed out so much during church. Enon Chapel is long gone, and the present site is occupied by the London School of Economics and the law courts. But still, the story is a great example of just how gross it really was to live in Victorian times. The Holy Right Hand. The Holy Right Hand might just be the creepiest artifact from Christian myth. It's really tough to say though, because Christianity has the weirdest artifacts by far. The Church apparently has Jesus Christ's preserved foreskin, the heads of various saints, and plenty of vials of blood from religious icons. Every year on August 20th, priests in Hungary take the severed hand of Saint Stephen out for a walk. They don't put it on a leash, but they do parade the hand around every year in celebration of the long-dead saint. The rest of the time, the Holy Right Hand remains inside its cage, preserved in glass and gold, and laid on a plush red pillow. Saint Stephen was one of the apostles of Jesus Christ. He was born in the year 5 AD, and according to the Bible, he died just a few years after Christ was crucified. Stephen angered members of Jewish synagogues in Jerusalem because of his preachings. He was accused of blasphemy and was stoned to death, and that means he was likely buried in a hole with just part of his body sticking out. Then people threw rocks at him until he was dead. Out of all the ways to go, I can't think of many that are worse than that. In 1083 AD, Stephen was officially canonized as a saint. As part of the ritual, his corpse was exhumed from where he'd been kept inside a dark crypt. Legend says that when he was dug up, his right arm was still perfectly as fresh as the day he was buried, 1,000 years earlier. The rest of him had decayed, but his right arm was just fine, so naturally priests chopped it off and preserved it as a holy relic. Nobody knows what happened to the hand in the 200 years that it floated around Europe. In the 13th century, it arrived in Dubrovnik, Croatia, and that was when the arm was cut in half. Part of it was sent to Lemberg and another part to Vienna. This was typically done so that churches didn't get jealous of each other, with one having cooler relics. It was like splitting up your Pokemon cards with your brother so that he doesn't cry to your mom. In 1771, the Austro-Hungarian Empire took Stephen's right hand for themselves. Then it was stolen in the midst of World War II, but it was brought back soon after, and it's been in Hungary since 1945. Crocodile armor. You've likely heard of metal armor, paper armor, and leather armor, but what do you know about crocodile armor? There's a suit of armor at the British Museum that was fashioned from a dead crocodilian. It's not just creepy, it's also the closest you'll ever get to seeing a real piece of fantasy gear from something like Dungeons and Dragons. The priceless crocodile suit was found in an Egyptian grotto somewhere near Manfalu. It likely wasn't used in combat, but rather as ceremonial clothing. According to the British Museum, there was a crocodile cult on the banks of the Nile River, and when the Romans invaded Egypt and took administrative control of the Nile Kingdom, they found themselves attracted to their strange animalistic cults. The cult of the crocodile was particularly interesting to them. Roman soldiers would participate in military-style ceremonies. However, I should tell you that historians have no idea what specifically went on in the ceremonies. They only know that they happened, not what the ceremonies involved. As for the crocodile armor, it would have been worn either by a leader of the cult or by the Roman soldiers involved in the ceremonies. The piece of armor at the British Museum includes a defensive jacket worn over the torso and a bizarre skull cap, all fashioned from crocodile scales about 1700 years ago. The Princess of Bolivia. 129 years after she was donated to the Michigan State University Museum, a Bolivian princess was returned home. The princess is in a mummified state. She's terrifying to behold, a young Incan girl looking like an embalmer's failed experiment. But the truth of her story isn't scary at all. It's tragic. She was only 8 years old when she died. The young girl was buried in an alpaca wool dress, likely after she was sacrificed. And because she was left in the Bolivian highlands, the chilly environment kept her amazingly preserved. The girl's black hair braids still look the same as they did 500 years ago, and in her small hands are the original feathers she was clutching at the time of her death. She perished right around the time the Spanish conquistadors arrived, which led to the collapse of the Inca civilization. 100 years of studies have revealed a lot about the mysterious child. She was ethnically part of the Amara people who lived near the ancient city of Tiwanaku on the shores of Lake Titicaca. The Amara flourished after the fall of the Tiahuanaco culture, who were the original builders of Tiwanaku. They first rose to power in 1200 AD, but by 1438 AD, they found themselves under threat by the Inca. When this little girl died, she was living in Inca-controlled territory. Although she was technically part of the Inca kingdom, she was ethnically in her own native group. People today often associate ancient Peru with the Inca Empire, but there were countless ethnicities, tribes, and cultures. Her mummified remains were found in a stone tomb. She was almost definitely part of the Amara elite, potentially a princess. Experts believe that she was likely drugged heavily, then murdered as part of an Inca ceremony. It wasn't all that unusual for the Inca to sacrifice children of ethnic groups they conquered to appease their own violent gods. Do you think the Amara Princess felt honored to be sacrificed to the gods? Or do you think she was too young to understand what was really happening? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Witch's Ladder. Folk magic has been practiced since the beginning of time and still exists in many places across the world. But one of the weirder magical talismans used in medieval witchcraft was something called a witch's ladder. A witch's ladder is made from a knotted cord or strand of hair. Along the strand, the user knots or braids charms, and each charm represents an aspect of a spell or a spell of its own. Every witch's ladder is different because each one contains different spells and charms. Normally the charms are represented as feathers, so the result is a long strand of hair braided with gross bird feathers. These aren't easy artifacts to find because hair and feathers decay and rot very quickly. The very first recorded witch ladder was discovered during the demolition of an old house in England in 1878. Inside a pocket between the roof and the upper room, the demolition workers found a whole trove of artifacts. At some point in the building's ancient history, a room had been sealed above the upper ceiling, and inside were 6 brooms, an armchair, and a witch's ladder. It feels a little too coincidental that the room was full of brooms and a relic from a witch. The Book of the Dead. In Egypt, archaeologists were investigating an ancient cemetery when they found something amazing. They came across a real copy of the Book of the Dead. This wasn't the Necronomicon, so don't get your hopes too high. It wasn't a demonic tome bound in human skin that could open portals to hell. Instead, this was the original Book of the Dead, a text written on papyrus that was meant to serve the deceased during their journey to the afterlife. How big do you think a 3,500-year-old book for dead people was? Remember, it was a papyrus, so it didn't have pages. I'm talking about foot measurements here, since a papyrus book was basically a large scroll. If you guessed 49 feet long, you were right on the mark. This book was ridiculously big. Imagine having to unroll a 40-foot piece of text, then trying to find where you left off. The book came from a burial ground at Tuna El Gabel, which is located in central Egypt. Archaeologists also found some new mummies, intriguing sarcophagi, and magical amulets. But the Book of the Dead stole the show just because of how complete and detailed it is. Egyptologist Foy Scalf said finding such a book is very rare, especially in the grave where it was originally buried. Scottish tomb skeletons. On a remote Scottish island, archaeologists uncovered a tomb from 5,000 years ago, and the ancient burial ground was found to contain 14 skeletons. Excavations in Orkney revealed an extremely ancient stone structure. The structure was buried underground, accessible through a passage moving 23 feet beneath the dirt. According to the National Museum Scotland, the tomb represents the pinnacle of engineering during Neolithic Britain. It was the Neolithic British equivalent of an Egyptian tomb in the Valley of the Kings. Inside the tomb were the skeletons of men, women, and children. There were also some other human remains piled in a small side chamber. Just finding skeletons wouldn't be that interesting, but the way in which these skeletons were positioned makes this a truly remarkable find. 2 of the skeletons were articulated in such a way that it looked as if they were embracing one another. The people were clutching each other in an eternal embrace, with the skeletons of 2 children buried over their heads. So, was this a family? And were their deaths part of another unknowable ritual from a Neolithic society? Scientists don't really know, which is honestly half the fun. Only 12 similar tombs have been found across Scotland's Orkney Islands. But sadly, this tomb was largely destroyed in the 19th century by locals who pillaged the stones to build a farmhouse. Which of these bizarre discoveries creeped you out the most? Let us know what you think in the comments down below. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye.